Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of Shady Oak Ministries episode review of the TV show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. I want to thank you for joining me here, and today we'll be going over the third episode in the first season of My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, the Ticketmaster. So, overall, as far as the biblical themes and applications of this episode, I think that there were four major events, or at least one main central plot issue from three different perspectives that I'd like to discuss. And along with that in the Bible, these things are directly paralleled in just some amazing ways. To start, the main problem in this episode was that Twilight, after a hard day at work and some serious lack of nourishment issues, she was then given by her mentor, Princess Celestia, 2 tickets to the Grand Galloping Gala, which after some research, yes, I actually looked this up, according to the canon of the show, that was meant for her and Spike. But along with her other 6 friends, hearing about the Grand Galloping Gala, the party that she was being asked to attend by these tickets, Twilight was then in a dilemma because not only being hungry herself, but all of her friends also had different, unique, and very important and personal reasons for wanting to go to this party. So Twilight, from her perspective, is the first one that I want to discuss as far as the overall biblical message of this episode. And along with that, I'd like you to turn with me in your Bibles, or if you have a Bible app in a separate window, or any other means of following along in Scripture, I'll be happy to read it to you, but it'd be awesome if you can follow along with me. Genesis chapter 25, verses 29 through 34. It's the story of Jacob and Esau. A little bit of a background story to this. If you want more in-depth details on this, I'd highly recommend Fresh Life Church, Pastor Levi Lusko's study on bread and circuses. It was a topical message with 5 different studies on how to live for more than just the trivial things in life, and he's been an incredible blessing to me, and I highly recommend him for getting a biblical perspective and being able to study the Bible not only verse by verse, but practical issue by practical issue, and an inspiration for this channel. The 2 messages, I'll actually be including the link to the website in the description below, or if you'd like to ask for it, just please ask in the comments. I'll be happy to send it to you. The message Red Pill, Blue Pill goes a lot into this, but Jacob and Esau were the twin sons of the son of Abraham, and I'm sure that's a well-known name. Abraham was the founding father of the Jewish nation, and it was from his descendants that was born the child of promise, who was Isaac, and then likewise after that, Isaac had 2 sons through his wife Rebekah. The first son was named Esau, which means hairy, and in that culture, actually, names just didn't sound good. They actually named them with things that associated with their personality and birth. So when Esau came out of his mother, they had one little thing to comment, and it was that he was a very hairy baby. Kind of not really just saying, oh, it's so beautiful. Oh, Levi has some great jokes on this. I'll just recommend you to his study, but it was a hairy child. And then following shortly up behind him, 2 for the price of 1, twins, was Jacob. And the name Jacob actually means in Hebrew, Yaakov, heel catcher, cheater, sneaky little dude. And with this in mind, it was because he was grabbing his brother's heel. You know, he's doing all the work. I'll just go along for the ride. To quote, again, Levi. You'll be finding I'll be doing this a lot in this study. In this account, the boys have grown up, and Jacob, verse 29, cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore, his name was called Edom, a nickname. It means red soup. It's basically associating with what the soup was. It was probably a bean soup, a chili. So Jacob said, being true to his personality and name, "Sell me your birthright as of this day." A birthright was, since Esau was the firstborn son of Isaac, and Isaac probably had a lot of money to his name, there's some things in the Bible that would suggest that, since they would be founding a nation off of this, that in that culture, when the father would die, the inheritance would be divided up 2 portions extra for the firstborn child, because naturally, based off of experience, since he's been around the longest, if you're going to be running the family business, if you're going to make sure that your sisters are off marrying good men, if you're going to be the spiritual leader of the home, you would be given more responsibility as far as if there were two kids in this case who would be dividing inheritance, they divided into thirds, and the first son would get 2/3. Again, the studies of Levi Lusko provide great insight into this. But with all this in mind, Jacob is saying, being the younger brother, taking advantage of the situation, sell me your birthright, since he's hungry. And Esau said, look, I am about to die. So what is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him, sold his birthright to Jacob, and Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, which basically chili. Then he ate and drank, arose, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So what you can tell from this story is that historically, the inheritance that would have gone to the Edomites, to the sons of Esau, instead went to Jacob, who would be later named Israel, because of a very smart decision that Jacob did in taking advantage of him when he was hungry. And again, in the study that I'll be referring you to, Red Pill, Blue Pill, you make very bad decisions when you're hungry. Twilight was in her roughest and most vulnerable dilemma, not only because it was a lose-lose situation, no matter which way she divided up the tickets, but on top of that, when your stomach is empty, not even your stomach as far as food, when you're in lack of satisfaction of anything, you start to embellish and overestimate details as far as, what you really need. You go to an ice cream store hungry, you're going to leave with a lot more calories than you really should have gone with. And on top of that, you go shopping, again, referencing for Levi Lusko, that when you go shopping hungry, you will buy so much stuff that you don't need, it's not even funny. And exactly in the place that Twilight was, you could imagine this was not only a stressful scenario and costing her friendships, but she was even in lack of something else, so she was being pulled in not only 6 different directions as far as this tickets and the 24 different possibilities that could have come out of the combinations of dividing these 2 tickets, even trying to do the generous thing and sacrificing her own ticket. You don't want to make important decisions when you're on an empty stomach. And I think that is something that needs to be considered as a takeaway truth from this episode, is that never make decisions when you're in a place where you're unsatisfied. This refers to anything. Again, since there's going to be a wide variety of ages that are going to be listening to this study, I want to keep it G-rated as possible, but if you listen to that study, Levi provides some excellent insights on this, and I just want to put that takeaway truth out there as the first one. Don't make important decisions when you're hungry. Now, with this as Twilight's perspective, and in making the right decision at the end, we'll come back to this at the end of the study, you could also know that there was a perspective, an entirely different one in fact, not only from the ticket master, but the ticket recipients. The main 6, the ponies who wanted to gain the favor of Twilight to try and get this ticket. Now, you remember that in the episode, for those of you who've seen it, I've hopefully seen this episode, I'm not spoiling anything for you out in later seasons, but the main 6 weren't thinking in Twilight's interest, and they came to this realization at the end of the episode, but only in putting their greatest benefit first in going to this party. Now, the Grand Galloping Gala was basically the build-up event of the entirety of Season 1, and the funniest part was, at the end of the season, it didn't turn out to be all that they had built it up to be. It didn't match the hype. And because they made these decisions, they basically had their own, some of them even had their own music numbers. They made fantasies and invested the success of their dreams and the fruition of all of their life's ambitions, all centered in on this one event. As the famous saying goes, you put all your eggs in one basket, you better hope that thing doesn't drop. Well, we, going into this a little bit later, have the advantage of knowing that this wasn't a wise decision to make, because, say, if Twilight did give up those 2 tickets to someone else, they all would have gotten disappointed, even if they were the ones receiving the ticket, because it wasn't as much as they set it out to be. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 15 through 21, again, this is also in the Bread and Circuses series by Levi Lusko. He provided an excellent insight in studying for this message. I highly recommend you listen to his study. It would be the study titled under Are You Not Entertained, which, a quote from the movie Gladiator. It's the best movie ever made. Why wouldn't you listen to that? Anyway, the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was giving a sermon, and during this sermon, it was covering a lot of very important issues as far as the eternal perspective and providing the things that only Jesus could give an eyewitness insight to. And he was interrupted by a kid in the crowd that had a similar debate that we talked about earlier with Jacob and Esau, but instead of, kind of going the manipulative route like Jacob did, he's instead going to a spiritual leader, which wasn't a bad thing. He wanted to provide spiritual insight, but if you actually read the passage of what he was doing, it doesn't really seem like a question at all. Let me actually start at verse 13 to give you a little bit of context. It said, "One from the crowd said to him," in the middle of the sermon, so just interruption, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he, Jesus, said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" Then he said to them, this is turning to his disciples, the people who actually were there to listen to what he had to say, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of the things he possesses." And then he spoke a parable to them, saying this parable would be an illustrative story that would help prove a finer point to those who actually were wanting to listen. Like, I'm using My Little Pony as a parable to you guys to help you understand biblical truths a little bit easier. Jesus is using farm-based stuff that would relate to the people of Israel in their time in history. So, following along, he's telling a fictional story of a man that was meant to personify the point of what this guy was doing, and exactly what I want to emphasize as what the main six were going to be covering in how they learned from their perspective it wasn't wise to invest all of these things at once. Take a breath, slow down. Verse 16, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully, and he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So a man who had a lot of good things going for him suddenly got a really good year." Basically, everything that his company was invested in growing farms and crops, he now had gotten the biggest crop of his life to the point where he had nowhere else to put all of his stuff. But instead of thinking in the interest of other people, like the main six refused to do, he has the exact same mindset that they did. And how can this benefit me in the greatest way possible? My dreams could be fulfilled by this incredible blessing that's just fallen into the laps of, really, the people who are working for me, but I'm the one who owns the company. So just like with the main six and the way they were putting kind of the pressure down on Twilight, it wasn't thinking in her best interest. It was saying, I need this to fulfill my dream. So, like Pinkie Pie's approach. Thank you, Twilight. It's the best gift I've ever gotten, not even getting the chance to find out what Twilight thought on the matter. Well, this was the man's response. So he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns, and I will build greater. And there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then who will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." Now, the emphasis is on God's perspective. We're talking a lot about the perspective of people in this dilemma that was being introduced to us in the episode that we're reviewing today. But recognize that in this story, especially in any given context, especially in life today, we need to recognize that just like our perspective in the show, and I'll be going into this on to the next point, is one that's seen not only all of Season 1, but Season 4, and how all of these things played out to come in handy in later troubles. Well, when God emphasized the point of not investing in things in this life, but stacking yourselves up treasure in heaven, we've talked about this in previous studies, the value of the eternal over the temporary. The one thing that the main six had never considered in putting all of their stock and all of their dreams and all of their confidence in the Grand Galloping Gala being everything that they had ever imagined, whether it be the greatest party Pinkie Pie would ever go to, or Applejack would make more money there than she'd ever had made anywhere else, or Rarity would meet Prince Blueblood and marry him. I'll let that sit out there for a second as a poorly invested decision. Or Twilight getting to spend time specially aside with Princess Celestia, or Spike getting to go on a tour through Canterlot with all of her friends and show them where he lived, or likewise Fluttershy to spend all this time with all these exotic creatures. It all fell apart at the one thing they never considered, is if the gala wasn't the party that they were expecting it to be, that the rich people wouldn't settle for Applejack's treats. She never considered that. Rarity, did she consider Blueblood would be just a flop? No. Did Pinkie Pie ever consider that the party would not be to the theatrics of what her mind was set to as a party would be? No. Did Fluttershy think all the animals would be naturally timid to the presence of other ponies? No. Did Twilight think that Celestia would be greeting all of the ponies and all of Canterlot during this entire meeting so that she would never have even a second to spend with her? No. Did this man, when he got more money in his life than he had ever had before, ever consider that the right thing to do would be to get his heart focused on the eternal, since he would die that night? No, the only thing he was focusing on was, I got that ticket, Rainbow Dash is going to get the favor of the Wonderbolts, all of these ponies are getting their dreams fulfilled. This guy got everything he ever wanted in this life, not realizing his life would end that night. It's really funny when you invest in something temporary, even if it seems stable in the moment, even if it seems like a good thing, like this rich young farmer was doing, or the rich farmer. That when you invest in anything, even life itself, it is a temporary thing. And God's perspective is eternal, and he's saying, today's the day of salvation. Get right with me, and maybe you will have tomorrow, but recognize that my perspective's a lot more accurate than yours, just like a perspective of, say, someone who's only seen Ticketmaster as the first episode of My Little Pony they've ever seen. And they ask our perspective on the show and saying, so who gets the ticket without even finishing the episode? Our lives are like that before God, in that he's seen the end from the beginning. He knew you since before you were a twinkle in your mother's eye. And with that in mind, recognize that when you trust God's perspective, actually, in the book of James, chapter 4, verses 13 through 15, James was actually a biological son of Mary, who was Jesus' earthly mother. But just as likewise, after Jesus was born through a virgin birth, Jesus had brothers and sisters after that, because the Bible specifies in saying that Mary did not know her husband Joseph, meaning they didn't have intimacy with each other in marriage until Jesus was born. Recognize just that as a side detail for any misunderstandings that may have gone thrown into the air throughout history. But in verse 13, James, who is basically the biological brother of Jesus, but never really considered himself anything more than just a disciple, which I think is cool, he emphasized in the importance of a Christian life and keeping perspective of God in this way, in that in verse 13 of chapter 4, he said, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we shall go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that." Well, with this perspective of recognizing that I am only, if barely, in control of where I am in my life right now today. I shouldn't plan on the future. Granted, it's important to have a perspective on life where you know where you're headed, but your final vote isn't cast in on everything being according to your plans. falling exactly into your fingertips, like you control the fabric of your life like an instrument. Well, just like with this rich young ruler, just like we're giving this example with the main six, all these fictional stories are true in that we need to recognize that God has a perspective and that he knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And sometimes the things that are happening today could be preparation for that, so we need to pay attention. We shouldn't be trying to get out of the problems or try to invest in the good things that happen to us in the moment, because just like riches make themselves wings and fly away, anyone who's had any amount of money for any amount of time knows that they are not a permanent commodity. Likewise, for those of you who have relationships, sometimes they're not going to be the ones that you marry right away. Sometimes they're just going to be preparation and learning lessons. Sometimes they can just be good friendships, and when you have relationships with the opposite gender, but it's not always going to match out the way that you would plan things. And James is insisting on this, just like I want to bring this into the next point, is that we've discussed Twilight's perspective. Don't make decisions, important decisions, when you're hungry, as quoted by Levi Lusko. The same thing as the perspective of the main six, in that don't put all of your hope in one thing when it turns out the one important detail you assumed would be just a given turns out to be the one thing that ended up making everything fall apart. Well, the other important thing to remember is that from our perspective, the show, for those of you who've seen all of Season 1, the season finale of Season 1 was the Grand Galloping Gala, and on hindsight, we found out it was better that they didn't compromise their relationships over this, because all of that sacrifice for none of the payoff would have been an overall bad deal, just like with Esau when he gave up his birthright. You could imagine that in the future he would seek it with tears. And he did. But the problem was, he had made an oath, because he made important decisions on an empty stomach. When he was in want, he let his desires decide for him what his heart and what his mind would have had much better insight to listen to than if he had just acted impulsively, to think things through and to recognize the assessment, the cost and benefit of these decisions. Likewise, you would also remember that at the end of the episode, this whole issue could have been avoided if Twilight had just gone to Princess Celestia before she even made one thought further on the matter. Because what did Celestia do when Twilight sent those tickets back saying, if my friends can't go with me, then I don't want to go? Why didn't you just say so, right? She sent her 6 more tickets. Well, in the book of James, chapter 4 and verse 2, this very same thing was brought up in just such the amazing way. It's in the latter part of the verse. He says, you do not have because you do not ask. When you're praying to God and wanting to do the things that honor him in your life, we as Christians want to depend more on Jesus. We want to trust him more for our futures. We want to be able to turn to him. For crying out loud, we want to be able to see things in the way that he wants us to see them, so that we could have the reason to trust him with the things that we find important in our lives. But the problem is, we don't have these things because, just like agape, it's impossible without him. And we don't have these capabilities because we never ask him. You don't have these tickets to the gala because you never took the consideration of saying Celestia would have been more than happy to give you these things. You would remember in earlier parables when Jesus was talking about how God finds it joy to give you his entire kingdom. So you don't need to worry about the little things in life like food and clothes, because God knows you need these things. If you're a Christian, you want to be able to trust God more. Or if you aren't a Christian, but you want to know how to become one. You know all this is true, but you just don't know how to receive that same peace because you think you're just unworthy, because you recognize how wrong you are without him. And you never thought of simply asking. It is that simple. I guarantee it. Just like with Twilight and the tickets, and just like with this, the decisions that we make every day do matter. into the future, and it's important we don't act impulsively on them, but I do emphasize that there is one decision that matters more than any other, and it's the decision of whether or not you are trusting in your life and the good things that you do to matter before God, or you trust in the life of Jesus Christ, God's own standard, perfect before him, given up freely for you. And through a personal relationship with him, he will stand for you on the one day that most of us don't even like to consider. That the one thing that we've made into our heaven, into our dreams, we don't want that to be wrong, because just like with the main six, if you don't plan on this, you're planning to fail. If you want a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, just like Twilight, all you need to do is ask. Thank you for your time and for listening to this study. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to ask questions below. God bless you.